The gunfire started the instant Traoré arrived. The air was heavy, the kind of silence that comes before a storm. Ouagadougou stood still that morning, its streets eerily quiet, as if the city itself sensed that history was about to turn violent. Crowds had gathered along the dusty roads, children hoisted on shoulders, women clutching faded flags, men whispering rumors of betrayal. They waited, not with joy, but with unease, because this was not an ordinary day. This was the day Captain Ibrahim Traoré was set to arrive. And then it happened. The convoy rolled forward, battered armored vehicles followed by black jeeps, their engines growling like caged beasts. As Traoré's car door swung open, time itself seemed to hold its breath. In that suspended heartbeat of silence, every eye locked on the man who carried Sankara's shadow on his shoulders. His red beret caught the morning sun, burning bright like a flame of defiance, and then chaos. The first crack of gunfire shattered the silence like glass. One shot, then two, then a storm of bullets. Panic tore through the crowd. Mothers shielded. Their children, men scrambled for cover, and screams rose like a tidal wave. Dust filled the air, smoke stung the eyes, and the city's heart pounded with terror. Traoré didn't flinch. Soldiers dove, civilians fled, but he stood rooted in the chaos. Gunfire rained from rooftops, from alleys, from shadows unseen. This was no random attack. This was betrayal, orchestrated with precision. 3 generals, men sworn to loyalty, had chosen this moment to strike, to bury Traoré before his vision for Africa could rise. Bullets carved the earth at his feet. Dust exploded around him. The world tilted into madness. In that instant, despair tightened its grip on Burkina Faso, for if he fell here, if he was silenced in this ambush, the last flame of resistance against the IMF and foreign powers would die with him. But something else stirred. Through the storm of violence, through the choking haze, he raised his fist, defiant, unbroken, an unspoken vow that echoed louder than the gunfire. Africa will not kneel. The crowd saw it, the soldiers saw it, even the traitors saw it, and in that single, impossible gesture, a fracture of hope cut through the suffocating despair. What happened next was not written in any strategy, not foreseen by any spy, not predicted by any general. It was the moment that would shatter illusions, ignite revolutions, and echo across the continent. The gunfire had begun the instant he arrived, but what Ibrahim Traoré did next shook the world. Burkina Faso, a land whose name itself means land of the upright people. Yet for decades, its people had been bowed by hunger, corruption, and the cold hand of foreign powers. The streets of Ouagadougou told a story written not in ink, but in dust, in empty bowls, in the weary eyes of mothers carrying children who cried not for toys, but for food. This was the world into which Ibrahim Traoré rose, a young captain carrying not only the weight of command, but the impossible burden of hope. Everywhere he went, the ghost of Thomas Sankara lingered. Posters with Sankara's Sharpie, gaze, murals painted on crumbling walls, the whispered stories of elders who remembered the brief years when dignity and independence had seemed possible. Sankara had stood tall against the IMF, against the World Bank, against the suffocating grip of neo-colonialism. But his defiance had cost him his life. And now, whispers spread like wildfire. Is Traoré the new Sankara? He never claimed the title, never wore it openly. But deep inside, he knew. He was walking a path paved with blood, betrayal, and broken promises. Famine gnawed at the villages. Crops failed under punishing droughts. Sanctions, cleverly disguised as aid conditions, strangled the economy. While elites dined in hidden villas, the poor scoured dry fields for grain husks. He had seen it with his own eyes. A mother in Kaya, tearing a piece of stale bread into 4, trying to convince her children it was enough. A farmer in Dori trading his last goat for a bag of imported rice, its price inflated by IMF restrictions, soldiers eating once a day, yet still reporting for duty with hollow eyes. Every step Traoré took reminded him, this was not about him. It was about survival. Foreign officials smiled in conferences, speaking of stability, partnership, and reforms. But the truth was raw. Behind closed doors, the IMF demanded gold, 60% of Burkina Faso's reserves, as collateral. Gold that belonged not to bankers in Paris, not to suits in Washington, but to the soil of Africa itself. When Traoré resisted, the threats followed swiftly. Sanctions, isolation, cut from aid. And beneath their polished words lay the venomous truth: surrender or starve. Inside the barracks, another storm brewed. 3 generals, veterans of endless regimes, men with medals heavy enough to break their uniforms, met in shadow. Their loyalty was not to Burkina Faso, but to power. They whispered of Traoré's youth, his naivete, his refusal to bow to the IMF. They mocked his red beret as theater, his speeches as dangerous, but beneath their sneers was fear. They saw in him something they could not control: belief. And so they made their pact. Quiet handshakes, foreign money sliding across tables. A deal struck in the dark: remove Traoré, restore order, and ensure that Burkina Faso remained shackled. Weeks turned into months. The tension thickened like smoke before a fire. IMF envoys tightened their grip. Hunger deepened. Murmurs of rebellion echoed through villages and cities alike. Traoré stood at a crossroads. On one side, surrender, bend to the IMF, silence the people, and live as just another puppet general. On the other, defiance, the path that had killed Sankara. The 3 generals sharpened their knives in secret. The IMF sharpened its sanctions abroad. And the people, starving yet unbroken, looked to Traoré not as a man, but as a last chance. And so, the stage was set. He would arrive in Ouagadougou on that fateful morning. The people would gather. The 3 generals would wait in the shadows, ready to strike. The gunfire had not yet begun. But destiny was already moving. Each week brought new sanctions. Shipments of rice vanished at the ports. The national airline was grounded by regulatory suspensions. Even medical aid shipments were stalled by endless paperwork. It was a quiet strangulation, leaving no fingerprints but leaving millions gasping. In the markets, despair replaced bargaining. Families no longer asked, "How much?" They asked only, "Do you have any left?" The IMF's invisible hand was tightening. In Kaya, a father traded his last goat for a sack of millet that would not last the week. In Ouahiguya, teachers dismissed classrooms early, too weak from hunger to continue. In Bobo Dioulasso, mothers carried malnourished children to clinics that had no medicine to give. The streets whispered the same thing again and again. How long can we endure this? Inside guarded villas, 3 generals met in secret. Their plan was no longer theory, it was execution. General Ouedraogo courted foreign diplomats, promising stability. General Sanu secured arms from shadowy traders. General Zongo quietly moved loyal units into the capital under the cover of routine exercises. They told themselves it was for Burkina Faso, but in truth, it was for power, for luxury, for the same foreign masters who had bled the land for centuries. Among Traoré's men, unity frayed. Some cursed him for provoking the IMF. Others feared the general's shadow networks. A few clung to him with blind loyalty, whispering, "He is the only one who still speaks for Sankara's dream." Traoré watched carefully. He knew betrayal was not coming from abroad. It was already inside the walls. Then came the message. Cold, precise, undeniable. Surrender your gold, open your minds, accept our terms, or be cut off completely. It was not negotiation. It was colonization, written in ink. The generals urged compliance. Give them what they want. Save your seat. Save your skin. But Traoré did not answer. In the countryside, whispers grew into chants. Farmers with empty hands still raised their voices. Students painted walls with slogans at night. Africa is not for sale. Crowds began to gather in the capital. Hungry, desperate, but unafraid. They did not come to beg. They came to stand. Something unseen was shifting. The IMF had starved them. The generals had betrayed them. But still, the people refused to kneel. Traoré knew the hour was near. He walked the halls of the barracks, seeing faces that no longer hid their doubt. He received intelligence of movements. Convoys arriving without orders, soldiers drilling at night, coded messages exchanged. The generals were readying their strike. The IMF had given its blessing. The people were reaching their breaking point. The air was heavy, like the sky before thunder. And though no shot had yet been fired, the land trembled as if it already knew. The moment was coming when silence would shatter. The city awoke to silence, but it was not peace. It was the pause before collapse. Traoré's convoy rolled slowly toward the Grand Assembly. Streets that once teemed with life now stood eerily empty. Windows shuttered, markets abandoned. Even the stray dogs had disappeared. Soldiers lined the route, their uniforms crisp, their rifles gleaming. But their eyes did not salute him. They watched, calculating, waiting. Every turn of the wheels carried him deeper into the web spun by his own generals. It happened the moment he stepped out of the armored vehicle. One crack, then two. Then a rain of gunfire ripped through the air. Civilians screamed. Loyal guards dove to shield him. The ground erupted with dust and shrapnel. The coup had begun. Explosions thundered from the east barracks. Armored vehicles blocked the bridges, power cut from entire districts. The three generals had executed their strike with precision. Their men stormed ministries, seized broadcast stations, and arrested ministers still loyal to Traoré. In minutes, Ouagadougou was no longer a city. It was a battlefield. Amid the bullets, Traoré refused to run. He stood tall in his red beret, pointing forward, shouting over the storm, "Hold the line! Burkina Faso will not fall today." His words cut through the smoke like steel, and something remarkable happened. Soldiers who had hesitated, torn by fear, now surged toward him. They were not following an order. They were following a man from their hidden command post. The generals watched the chaos unfold. Sanu sneered, "He cannot last an hour." Ouedraogo muttered, "The people will not fight for him." Zongo raised a glass, already tasting victory. But they had miscalculated one thing. The people were not running. Hunger had broken their bodies, but not their spirit. Crowds surged into the avenues. Unarmed farmers, students, women with infants, tied to their backs. They shouted, they sang, they hurled stones at armored trucks. What the generals thought would be fear became fire. And in that fire, Traoré stood at the center, unyielding, unbroken, a living symbol of the promise that Africa's chains could be shattered. By dusk, the city was engulfed in smoke. Both sides bled, both sides burned. But everywhere Traoré appeared, the tide shifted. His presence turned hesitation into courage. His defiance turned chaos into resistance. The generals had unleashed their coup, but they had also unleashed something far more dangerous. A people who had nothing left to lose. The gunfire had started, but so too had something the generals never expected, a revolution they could no longer control. The capital burned long into the night. Flames rose from the ministries seized by traitors. Streets were littered with broken rifles, shattered glass, and the blood of the innocent. The air reeked of smoke and fear. But amid the chaos, something else filled the air. A rhythm, a chant, a roar. The people would not be silenced. They poured into the boulevards by the tens of thousands, shouting one name again and again, "Traoré! Traoré! Traoré!" Inside their fortified compound, the three generals watched the city slip from their hands. Sano paced in fury. Ouedraogo shouted at commanders who no longer answered his calls. Zongo sat in silence, the glass in his hand trembling. Reports flooded in, armored battalions refusing to fire on civilians. Entire units abandoning the generals and pledging loyalty back to Traoré. Farmers and workers blocking roads, preventing reinforcements from reaching the capital. The coup had lasted hours, not days. Their betrayal was collapsing. By dawn, Traoré stood once more at the steps of the Grand Assembly. His uniform was torn, his beret streaked with dust, but his posture was unbreakable. He raised his voice to the exhausted soldiers and terrified crowds before him. They thought gunfire would silence us, but today we have proved that the soul of a nation cannot be killed. Burkina Faso will never kneel again. The words rippled like thunder. Men and women wept openly. Soldiers slammed their rifles against the pavement in salute. Children climbed onto shoulders, fists raised high. Block by block, the people reclaimed the capital. Mothers dragged barricades into the streets to stop fleeing traitors. Students stormed radio stations to replace the general's propaganda with calls for unity. Farmers, their hands still calloused from the soil, brought food and water to soldiers who had not eaten in days. The coup that was meant to fracture the nation had fused it together. By the second day, 2 of the generals had been captured. Their convoys were intercepted as they tried to flee toward the border. The last Zongo was cornered within the city. When he was dragged before Traoré, the once proud man trembled like a child. Traoré did not strike him. He did not shout. He simply whispered words that echoed louder than any bullet. "You betrayed your people. That is punishment enough." Far away in foreign boardrooms, men in suits watched the events unfold with unease. They had funded the coup. They had written the promises. They had bet on generals who had sworn to deliver gold in exchange for power. Now those generals were broken, and the world had seen it. No decree from Washington or Paris could erase the image of a barefoot farmer standing defiantly before a tank, and the tank turning away. In the weeks that followed, Traoré did more than survive. He became a symbol. His red beret, once a mere uniform, now fluttered on flags painted by children. His words were whispered in marketplaces, sung in churches, and etched onto the walls of schools. Across Africa, whispers spread, "If Burkina Faso can resist, why not us? If Traoré can stand, why can't we?" In Dakar, students marched, with banners bearing his name. In Bamako, women sang his speeches as lullabies to their children. In Accra, a boy scribbled a single phrase on the walls of his classroom: "Africa will rise." Months later, when the ashes had cooled, Traoré stood once more before his people. He did not promise wealth. He did not promise an easy road. Instead, he promised something far more dangerous. We may still be poor. We may still hunger. But we are no longer slaves, and that, my brothers and sisters, is the beginning of freedom. The crowd erupted. For the first time in decades, hope felt tangible. Western powers tightened their sanctions. Analysts predicted collapse. Newspapers called him a reckless dreamer. But the people no longer listened. They had seen a man step out of a car, face gunfire, and refuse to bow. They had seen ordinary citizens defy tanks with nothing but their hands, and they had seen that even the greatest powers in the world could not crush a nation that had found its voice. Years later, historians would ask, what truly began that day? Was it merely the survival of a coup attempt? Or was it something larger, a spark that spread from Burkina Faso to the rest of Africa? No one could answer with certainty. But every African who had lived through that day carried the same memory. The key moment when gunfire filled the air, and instead of silence, the continent heard something else. The first heartbeat of freedom.